Hey everybody, welcome back to 12 Days of Rilke. This is day number 6, the 6th day of Christmas. And we're going to be looking at letter 6 in Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke, translated by Stephen Mitchell. Let's begin. My dear Mr. Capus, I'm still not sure. My dear Mr. Capus, I don't want you to be without a greeting from me when Christmas comes and when you, in the midst of the holiday, are bearing your solitude more heavily than usual. What do you think this is? Why do you think he's bearing his solitude more heavily than usual? Do you think it's because of the nature of his profession, that he's away from society and he's remembering his family and his friends who he may have gathered with on Christmas, and his job prohibits him from going to join those gatherings? Or maybe he's more like some of us. When he goes to the gatherings with his family, he feels more alone than ever, perhaps because he feels um, he feels their wills and their wishes and their ideas being imposed upon him in such a way that it makes him feel more alone, right? Maybe that's what's going on here. It's just like how we can go be part of a vibrant community, but since we aren't rooted in our own individual self just quite yet, we begin to lose ourselves within the community, and that produces another kind of loneliness. Or maybe we might even consider social media, how you can have 2,000 friends on Facebook, and every post you get gets dozens of likes and dozens of comments and so many interactions, and yet you've never felt more alone than in those moments. Because while you have those artificial contacts and those little red notification symbols, you don't actually have anybody with whom you can really and truly commune. And isn't this what happens sometimes in church on Sunday? We're surrounded by people, dozens of people, worshiping God together. And yet, besides an hour on Sunday, maybe 2 hours, maybe 1 hour in the middle of the week, we don't really see them or talk to them or have any kind of real, meaningful, long connection. That's sad, but that's the reality for so many people. However, he says that when you notice that it is vast, when you notice that your solitude is vast, you should be happy. For what would a solitude be that was not vast? He says there is only one solitude, and it is vast, heavy, difficult to bear, and almost everyone has hours when he would gladly exchange it for any kind of sociability, however trivial or cheap, for the tiniest outward agreement with the first person who comes along, the most unworthy. But perhaps, he says, these are the very hours during which solitude grows. So just pause there for a moment. He says that when we notice that our solitude is vast, we should be happy because solitude is vast. And it's not a solitude that's separated from other people, but it's a solitude that allows genuine connections with other people, because we're not just being a chameleon and conforming to their will, but we're actually really and truly being ourselves. And he says that sometimes during these moments when it becomes difficult to bear the solitude, we're happy for any kind of sociability. And yet, it is these hours, he says, in which solitude grows. For its growing is painful as the growing of boys and sad as the beginning of spring. He says, but that must not confuse you. What is necessary, after all, is only this solitude, vast inner solitude, to walk inside yourself and meet no one for hours. That is what you must be able to attain. Because remember, this young man's trying to write poetry. He's trying to create something. If everything that we create flows out of other people's wishes, other people's desires, other people's plans and schemes for our life, we'll never truly be happy. It's only when we go into our solitude, when we go into our individuality, that we'll be able to create what is necessary to us and not create things based off of what other people are imposing upon us. I think we see this a lot with preachers, pastors, teachers. Whenever they stand before a congregation, they preach what people want to hear. They preach what some people think that they need to hear, instead of listening to the Spirit, instead of listening to what is necessary from within their innermost being. They end up producing sermons that are fine sermons, but that don't flow from that urgency. They don't flow from that necessity. And so he talks about these grown-ups that look busy but aren't really doing anything. And I think that's sometimes what we fall into as well. He says, to be solitary as you were when you were a child, when the grown-ups walked around involved with matters that seemed large and important because they looked so busy and because you didn't understand a thing about what they were doing. It's this childlike attitude that's not naive, but that's honest and that's real and that's curious, from which we can really begin to create and to be really and truly ourselves. He says, we're talking about the grown-ups. When you realize that their activities are shabby, that their vocations are petrified and are no longer connected with life, like trying to preserve the beauty of Rome, why not then continue to look upon it all as a child would, as if you're looking at something unfamiliar, out of the depths of your own world, from the vastness of your own solitude, which is itself work and status and vocation? Why should you want to give up a child's wise, not understanding, in exchange for defensiveness and scorn, since not understanding is, after all, a way of being alone, whereas defensiveness and scorn, he says, our participation in precisely what, by these means, you want to separate yourself from. So he's encouraging his young friend to embrace what's called beginner's mind, not trying to look at everything as an expert or as a learned person, but trying to approach everything with the childlike wonder that's within us from a very young age that we learn to move away from. Perhaps this is what Jesus meant when he said, unless you're converted and become as a little child, you will not enter into the kingdom of heaven. It's this childlike wonder, this childlike awe, this childlike innocence, being willing to ask um, deep questions, not being willing to question the status quo, or not being afraid, I should say, to question the status quo, not being afraid to look at all the false busyness that grown-ups have as being silly and redundant and not really life-giving, as being stale. And so he says, why would you want to give up a child's wise, not understanding, in exchange for defensiveness and scorn? I think this is sometimes what we see in that's the downfall of many believers, is they move away from this childlike not understanding, and they take on for themselves this false idea as if they know everything. And so when we talk about God, some believe that they're talking about one whom they really and truly know on an intellectual level, instead of being one by whom that they are known, as being one by whom they are held, as one who has control and mastery over them, right? Being caught up in the wonder and the love and the awe. You know, a baby truly knows her mom, but the baby isn't able to explain what it is about the mom that she knows. She just knows that she's caught up in the mother's love. And that's how we are. We're caught up in God's love. We're caught up in the beauty of nature without having to murder to dissect. All right. So Rilke goes on and he says for his young friend to think and to remember his own childhood. He says, only be attentive to what is arising, notice, within you, and place that above everything that you perceive around you. Notice what's within you. Place that above everything you perceive around you. If you're really going to create, if you're really going to write, if you're really going to preach, to teach, to dance, to play music, to imagine, then follow the voice that's deep within you. Is this voice influenced by stuff around you? Yes. But don't allow convention and tradition and orthodoxy and liturgy or whatever it is to box you in into something that's not you. Follow the voice of the Spirit. Listen to what your calling actually is. He says, what is happening in your innermost self is worthy of your entire love. Somehow you must find a way to work at it and not lose too much time or too much courage in clarifying your attitude toward people. Don't worry about what all these other people think, what all these other people are saying, what your perspective is on their work, on their writing, on their literature. Remember, to Rilke, literary critics are like the lowest tier forms of writing that there are. And so he says, don't worry about what everybody else is doing. Just focus on what it is that arises from within you out of necessity. He says, I know your profession is hard and full of things that contradict you, and I foresaw your lament and knew it would come. Now that it has come, there is nothing I can say to reassure you. He says, yes, you've entered into this profession that's really difficult. It's really crushing. It gives you a physical kind of solitude, but this kind of solitude isn't the real kind of solitude that you need, because you can only learn true solitude, oddly enough, in the midst of other people. And so he says, now that it has come, there's nothing I can say to reassure you. I can only suggest that perhaps all professions are like that, filled with demands, filled with hostility toward the individual, saturated, as it were, with the hatred of those who find themselves mute and solid and insipid duty. He says all professions are geared at destroying the destroying the individual, destroying the solitude, because professions, in a sense, need to make puppets. It needs to make parrots. It needs to make clones. And he says, so of course, this idea of being true to yourself doesn't have any place in most professions. He says, the situation you must live in now is not more heavily burdened with conventions, prejudice, and false ideas than all the other situations. And if there are some that pretend to offer a greater freedom, there is nevertheless none that is, in itself, vast and spacious and connected to the important things that the truest kind of life consists on. So he says, yes, every profession has this kind of thing attached to it, because it's not about your situation or your context or where you are, who you're around. It's about cultivating your innermost life. That's really what this is about. It's not about your external circumstances. And so Paul would say in Philippians chapter 4 that he has learned in all situations to be content, no matter whether he's in prison or whether he's free or whether he's persecuted or whether he's safe or whether he's among friends or whether he's among enemies. He's learned to be content. And that's what Rilke is trying to get across here. All professions, all situations have this tendency to be hostile towards the individual. He says, but you can still retreat into your solitude and learn truly what it means to be yourself. He says, only the individual who is solitary is placed under the deepest laws like a thing. And when he walks out into the rising dawn or looks out into the event-filled evening, and when he feels what is happening there, all situations drop from him as if it were a dead man, though he stands in the midst of pure life. So here he says that you can cultivate this attitude in which all situations, all the externals, all the feelings and ideas and thoughts that are constantly attacking your individuality and your solitude, you can cultivate a certain perspective on these where they just all fall to the wayside. And so even in the midst of clutter and hurry and pressure, we can learn to find our solitude. We can learn to be who we are called to be without these external influences. He says what this young man needs to do is understand that he feels this way in this possession, rather in this profession, and he'd feel the same way in any other profession, because the profession isn't what he does. It's not what he's called to do. There's a line that I picked up on from Rob Bell in a book that he did called Handling Your Fire. It's an audiobook. And he says that whenever somebody asks you, what do you do? Maybe I'll give you an example. So somebody says, Daniel, what do you do? And I'll say, oh, that's easy. I like to write. I like to play mandolin. And I go on hikes. And they're like, no, what do you do? Well, that's what I do. Oh, do you mean what my profession is? Oh, well, right now I just happen to be a minister at the North Broad Street Church of Christ, for the time being. And it kind of throws them off, right? Because when they say, what do you do? They mean, what is your profession? And instead, we need to redefine that. No, what I do is what I must do. The current setup that I'm in, that's flexible. I'm always going to do what I do. How I do it or how it manifests itself, though, might change depending on the situation. We have to hold those things loosely. He goes on and he says, even if outside of any position, you had simply tried to find some easy and independent contact with society, this feeling of being hemmed in would not have been spared you. Everybody has to go through this, whether you're in a profession or not in a profession. One that promises liberty or one that takes it away, you still have to deal with this, because it's like this everywhere. Feeling hemmed in, feeling like there is a hostile act towards our individuality. He says, but this is no cause for anxiety or sadness. If there's nothing you can share with other people, try to be close to things. They will not abandon you. And the nights are still there, and the winds that move through the trees and across many lands. Everything in the world of things and animals is still filled with happening, which you can take part in. So even if you don't have people with whom you can share these experiences from your solitude and also in their solitude, there's always nature. There's always creation that we can learn from and watch and take pleasure in. He says, think about how you were when you were a child. You once again, live among them, among the solitary children, and the grown-ups are nothing, and their dignity has no value. So return to that childlike wonder where you realize that the dignified busyness of all the adults is really nothing. It's really just so silly, and it's honestly childish, right? Childish in the bad sense. Um, he does bring up now the topic of God. Mr. Kappas is apparently going through somewhat of a faith crisis, and this latter part of chapter 6 here of letter 6 is really compelling, and it actually bears a lot of resemblance to Meister Eckhart. So much of what um, he writes in these letters bears resemblance to Meister Eckhart. Let's read. He says, it frightens and torments you to think of childhood and of the simplicity and silence that accompanies it, because you can no longer believe in God, who appears in it everywhere. Then ask yourself, dear Mr. Kappas, whether you have really lost God. So he says you don't believe in God, and you're acting as if you've lost God. But if you don't believe in him, did you ever really have him? Is his point. Because if you don't believe in him, that God exists, then you never really have God. So he says, isn't it much truer to say that you've never possessed him? For when could that have been? Do you think that as a child you can hold him, him whom grown men bear only with great effort and whose weight crushes the old? Do you suppose that someone who really has him could lose him like a little stone? So if you ever really did have God, you wouldn't have ever lost him, he says. So maybe it's more appropriate to say that you never had God, if you're losing faith in this way. And he says this, or don't you think that someone who once had him could only be lost by him? Don't you think that someone who has once had him could only be lost by him? In other words, if you've ever had God, you have nothing to worry about, because he's not going to lose you. That's for sure. But he goes on and says, but if you realize that he did not exist in your childhood and did not exist previously, if you suspect that Christ was deluded by his yearning and Muhammad deceived by his pride, and if you are terrified to feel that even now he does not exist, even at this moment when we're talking about him, what justifies you then, if he never existed, in missing him like someone who passed away, and in searching for him though he were lost? So he's like, you're writing to me about your lack of faith in God, and you're sad about your lack of faith. But if God doesn't exist, then why are you acting like you've lost him? Because in that case, you've never had him to begin with. And so Mr. Rilke is going to totally change this young man's perspective, or at least attempt to change this young man's perspective of how he views God. He says, instead of thinking about the God of your childhood, the God whom you used to have, why don't you think about God as the one who is coming, as the one who's arriving? And he uses some interesting imagery to describe the arrival of God that again bears a lot of semblance to Meister Eckhart. So he says, why don't you think of him as the one who is coming, who has been approaching from all eternity, the one who will someday arrive, the ultimate fruit of a tree whose leaves we are. So he's like, instead of, maybe you're not totally good with the idea of God being the Alpha. Well, Jesus says he's the Alpha and the Omega, so let's think about God as the Omega for a second. And so he says that he's the ultimate fruit of a tree whose leaves we are. This is an interesting idea, but I think it's related to what Paul says in Colossians 3, that uh, that Christ is revealed and our life is revealed in Christ when he's most clearly seen in the body. That is when the body of Christ reaches its maturity, when it puts off the old self and puts on the new self, which is the image of Christ. That's when Christ is revealed. That's when Christ is body forth. And so he says, perhaps God is the ultimate fruit of a tree whose leaves we are. That is, maybe you don't believe in God, Mr. Kappas, because you can't yet see God, and you can't yet see God because you've yet to live up to your full potential. You've yet to produce this fruit that leads unto eternal life. And so maybe he says, maybe you should be more patient with this and don't just jump to a conclusion that God doesn't exist. Maybe you should be patient and be watchful and be expectant. He says, what keeps you from projecting his birth into the ages that are coming into existence and living your life as a painful and lovely day in the history of a great pregnancy? He says, so instead of being sad about what you feel like you've lost in the past, why don't you yearn for what's coming in the future? He says, don't you see how everything that happens is again and again a beginning? And couldn't it be his beginning, since in itself starting is always so beautiful? So he says, why would you be settled with something that, like Rome, is established in the past? There it is back there. If we really want to have success, we'll get back to what it is. why don't you see this necessity that you feel to write, this necessity that you feel to enter into your solitude? Why don't you see that as evidence of God, as evidence of the manifestation of God, as a revelation of God, as an epiphany of God? Why don't you, pay more attention to that aspect of it? Is basically his idea. If he is the most perfect one, the telos, must not what is less perfect precede him, so that he can choose himself out of the fullness and superabundance? Must not he be the last one, so that he can include everything in himself? And what meaning would we have if he whom we are longing for has already existed? And again, I think that he's not saying that God hasn't already existed. Otherwise, how could he choose himself? I think the idea here again is that Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega. He's the first and the last. He's the beginning and the end. That God is the I am. So since God is I am, it's true to speak of God as having already existed and existing, but it's also true of to speak of God as the coming one, as the one who's always at hand, as the one who's always on the cusp of arriving, because God is eternal. He's outside of time. And he's just trying to reorient this young man's thinking to, instead of focusing so much on the failures of the past, to look forward with optimism to the beauty of the future. He says, as bees gather honey, so we collect what is sweetest out of all things and build him, even with the trivial, with the insignificant, as long as it is done out of love. We begin with work and with the repose that comes afterward, with a silence or with a small solitary joy, with everything that we do alone, without anyone to join or help us. We start him whom we will not live to see, just as our ancestors could not live to see us. So he says we're preparing something for the future. We are building something for the next generation. And just like our ancestors didn't live to see us, we may never live to see the outcome of the work that we're doing now. And yet we put our hand to the plow and we work and we move forward and we build to create something beautiful for the future generations. He says, and yet they who passed long ago still exist in us as predisposition, as burden upon our fate, as murmuring blood, and as a gesture that rises up from the depths of time. So he says, and yet, even though those who come before us have died and gone on, they still live again. They still live within us and can witness and experience these things. This is what we might know in Christianity as the communion of the saints. The idea, as Eugene Peterson said, that when we're worshiping together on Sunday morning, for instance, the people that we don't see far outnumber the people that we do see. And so, yes, we're building towards something that we may never see in this life, but we're always participating in it. We're always growing. We're always witnessing the fruit of the new creation. He says, is there anything that can deprive you of the hope that in this way you will someday exist in him who is the farthest, the outermost limit? Remember, the one who includes all things in himself, as he says in the previous page, taken maybe from Colossians chapter 3 or 1 Corinthians 15 or Ephesians chapter 1 or Colossians chapter 1, where Christ is all in all, where Christ sums up all things, reconciles all things into himself. He says, so you've lost faith in the God of your childhood, but could you believe that the God of the future, the God who is coming, perhaps? Maybe that's the way that you could think about this. And so he tells this young man who's suffering doubt, he says, celebrate Christmas in this devout feeling. That is, this feeling of expectation, that perhaps he needs this very anguish of yours in order to begin. These very days of your transition are perhaps the time when everything in you is working at him, as you once worked at him in your childhood breathlessly. So he says, yes, this is not an occasion for sorrow, but maybe this pain you're experiencing is birth pain, and your faith will be born from this trial. So he says, be patient, be without bitterness, and realize the least we can do is make coming to existence no more difficult for him than the earth does for spring when it wants to come. So he says, we just need to be ready. We just need to produce fruit. We just need to be hopeful and be expectant and lower expectations and be willing to be the means through which that God is seen in the world. I just love this. This is so much fun. Um, this may be not language that you or I would use to talk about God, especially those of us who maybe hold to a different eschatological paradigm. But to me, I find some of his language so compelling, even if we don't always see eye to eye. And I hope you find some of this language compelling as well. Okay, we're coming up on letter 7. And just to let you know, letter 7 and letter 8 are two of the longer letters and more content-packed letters in the book. And so we're going to split both of those up into 2 videos, and thus we'll have 12 full days of Rilke instead of just 10 days of Rilke. All right. Hope you have a great day, and God bless.